Louisville, Kentucky, 1942. A baby boy named Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. was born into a world that would judge him first by the color of his skin and second by the content of his character. Nobody could have predicted that this child would grow up to become not just the greatest boxer of all time, but a symbol of resilience, courage, and unwavering conviction in the face of overwhelming adversity. The year was 1967, and America was a nation divided. The Vietnam War raged overseas, while civil rights battles were fought on home soil. Muhammad Ali, formerly known as Cassius Clay, stood at the center of this turbulent storm. He had already shocked the world 3 years earlier by defeating Sonny Liston to become heavyweight champion, but his greatest fight was about to take place outside the ring. If this story has already made you feel something, no matter how small, don't leave without giving back. Comment and tell me where you're watching this video from, and subscribe to the channel. Ali's refusal to be drafted into the U.S. Army based on his religious beliefs as a Muslim and his opposition to the Vietnam War had made him a controversial figure. The press conference scheduled for April 3rd, 1967 in Houston, Texas, was supposed to be about his upcoming fight. Instead, it became the stage for one of the most defining moments in sports history. The room was packed with journalists, many of whom had already written their narratives about the draft dodger. The air felt heavy with tension as Ali approached the podium, his usual confident swagger tempered by the weight of what was to come. He knew that within 24 hours, he would officially refuse induction into the armed forces, a decision that would cost him his heavyweight title, his boxing license, and nearly 4 years of his prime fighting career. As he began to speak about his upcoming bout, the questions quickly shifted to his stance on the draft. The first boos began as subtle murmurs, then grew louder as more reporters joined in. These weren't just disagreements, they were expressions of contempt from people who viewed him as unpatriotic, as someone shirking his duty while other young men were dying overseas. The camera flashes were blinding, each burst of light capturing a moment that would soon be splashed across newspapers nationwide. Ali's eyes, usually dancing with mischief and confidence, now burned with something deeper, resolve, certainty, and the quiet strength of a man standing firm in his truth despite knowing the consequences. The booing reached a crescendo as one particularly hostile reporter stood up. "Don't you care about the boys dying in Vietnam? Don't you think you have a responsibility as an American citizen?" he shouted over the noise. The room fell silent, all eyes on Ali. This was the moment they were waiting for. The controversial champion backed into a corner. Many expected him to lash out in anger or stumble through a defense of his position. Instead, Muhammad Ali took a deep breath and looked directly at the reporter. His voice, when it came, was calm but carried to every corner of the suddenly quiet room. "Why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam, while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs? I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong." The simplicity and raw honesty of his words cut through the hostility like a laser. This wasn't a rehearsed political statement. This was a man speaking his truth, regardless of the cost. But it was his next sentence that truly silenced the room, the one sentence that would echo through history and make those who booed him regret it forever. "No, I am not going 10,000 miles from home to help murder and burn another poor nation, simply to continue the domination of white slave masters of the darker people the world over." The room froze. Pens stopped moving across notepads. Camera shutters fell silent. The moral clarity and courage behind those words landed with the same precision and force as Ali's legendary right hand. In that moment, he wasn't just refusing to fight in Vietnam, he was challenging America to confront its own contradictions. Some journalists looked down, unable to meet his gaze. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The man who moments before had been the target of their derision had just articulated a perspective that forced them to question not just their views on Ali, but on the war itself, on race in America, and on their own roles in perpetuating narratives that dehumanized those who dared to dissent. The next day, April 4th, 1967, Muhammad Ali refused induction into the U.S. Armed Forces. He was arrested, found guilty of draft evasion, sentenced to 5 years in prison, fined $10,000, and stripped of his heavyweight title. His boxing license was suspended in all 50 states, effectively ending his career at the age of 25, the prime of his athletic life. The Houston press conference had been merely the prelude to this moment. As Ali walked out of the induction center, a small crowd had gathered. Some shouted slurs, others called him a traitor, but there were also those who had heard his words from the day before, words that were already spreading across the country through newspaper headlines and television reports. For the next 3.5 years, Ali was unable to fight professionally. He traveled the country instead, speaking at colleges and rallies. The man who had made his living with his fists now made his mark with his words. At Howard University, he addressed a crowd of over 4,000 students. "I've been banned from boxing for 3 years for standing up for what I believe in. I have lost everything, my title, millions of dollars, maybe even my future. But I have gained something much more valuable, my dignity and self-respect." Many of those who had booed him at that fateful press conference watched as public opinion slowly began to shift. The Vietnam War became increasingly unpopular, and Ali's principled stand started to look less like cowardice and more like courage. Some of those same journalists who had scorned him began writing different stories now, stories about a man who had sacrificed everything for his beliefs. One reporter who had been particularly vocal in his criticism wrote a column in 1969 that began, "I was wrong about Muhammad Ali. We all were. It takes a special kind of courage to stand alone against the tide of popular opinion, to face hatred and financial ruin rather than compromise one's principles." The Supreme Court would eventually overturn Ali's conviction in 1971 in a unanimous 8-0 decision. Justice John Harlan II, who had initially voted against Ali, changed his mind after reading Black Muslim teachings and recognizing the sincerity of Ali's religious objections to the war. When Muhammad Ali returned to the boxing ring in October 1970 against Jerry Quarry in Atlanta, he was a different man than the one who had left. The 3.5 years away had cost him his speed and some of his skill, but they had solidified his status as something more than just a boxer. He had become a symbol of moral courage. The press conference in Houston, that moment when they booed and he responded with uncompromising truth, had marked the beginning of his transformation in the public eye. Many of those who had once despised him now cheered for him. The journalists who had written scathing articles about the draft, Dodger now wrote about the man who had stood by his convictions when it would have been easier and more profitable to compromise. Ali would go on to regain the heavyweight championship not once, but twice more. He would fight legendary battles against Joe Frazier and George Foreman. He would become the most recognized face on the planet. But for many, his greatest victory had come not in the ring, but at that press conference podium, when he had faced a hostile room and responded not with anger, but with clarity of purpose. Years later, one of the journalists who had been in that room in Houston reflected, "I've covered sports for 4 decades, but I've never forgotten that day." When Ali said those words, it wasn't just about Vietnam or race or religion. It was about having the courage to stand in your truth when the whole world is telling you that you're wrong. Those of us who booed him that day, We weren't just wrong about the war. We were wrong about what courage looks like. By the time Ali lit the Olympic torch with trembling hands at the 1996 Summer Games in Atlanta, battling the Parkinson's disease that had silenced his once unstoppable voice, even his most ardent former critics acknowledged the debt that society owed him. The man they had once booed had helped America find its conscience. That single sentence spoken in a Houston press conference, "No, I'm not going 10,000 miles from home to help murder and burn another poor nation simply to continue the domination of white slave masters of the darker people the world over," had done more than silence a room. It had echoed through time, challenging each new generation to consider the courage required to stand alone, to speak truth to power, and to sacrifice everything for what you believe is right. Muhammad Ali passed away on June 3rd, 2016, but the legacy of that moment when they booed him and he responded with truth continues to resonate. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful punch isn't thrown with a fist, but delivered with words spoken from the heart, with conviction that cannot be shaken, even when the whole world stands against you. If you've made it this far and felt every word, don't leave without subscribing. I tell these stories with my heart on my sleeve to reach people like you who feel, who get emotional, who truly live. If this touched you deeply, give back, comment, subscribe. Come be part of this family with me until the next video.